So in our processes of growth, we do have to adjust ourselves constantly. We have to adjust ourselves also dramatically to the changing in world conditions around us. But these adjustments do not necessarily mean general acceptance of that about which we have reasonable reservation. We cannot say that all the changes in society are essentially growth. We must either accept the uncertainty of the time and go with it, dominated by the reasonable certainty that we will all come to trouble together, or else we must, in one way or another, attempt to be ourselves, or to preserve the instincts and intuitions which we hold to be reasonable, regardless of the pressure of these times. A compromise in this is more or less dangerous, and the individual who gets along the best is the individual who decides and follows one course or the other. If he decides simply to adapt himself to circumstances, he gains a certain freedom from stress as far as personal adjustments are concerned. But he becomes like a rudderless ship floating upon a stormy sea, and its course controlled entirely by the winds, the tides, and the currents. He therefore has very little to say about his own destiny. He has very little reasonable hope that his own purposes will ever be fulfilled. To be adjusted under such situation means that he has few hopes, that he has no clear purposes, that he is perfectly willing to live day by day, and to have a certain hope that persons he does not trust will ultimately protect him. This situation is reasonably common. In fact, we are being actually indoctrinated with it almost continuously today. We are being given a kind of brainwashing. The principal end of brainwashing being that we wash out the entire brain structure, leaving nothing in the terms of individual intellection. That by the time the brain is clean, it is also totally empty. Now, there are a great many persons whose attitudes are such that this is not difficult for them to accept. They have never been really thinkers. They have never planned any general course. They've never had any general conviction about what was good for them or what was not good for them. And they therefore honestly believe that the best thing they can do is agree with other people, in this way enjoying the maximum social relationship with others. A thoughtful person, however, has reached a point where such a procedure simply is not possible. If he attempts it, he hates himself. He is not able to adjust to a situation which he cannot internally accept. He can only be a play actor, taking a part or in a role which he has created, but which he never identifies with himself. He may be discouraged and allow himself to drift with this general tide, but it is never, according to his thinking, the best thing to do, the proper thing to do, or that which is most productive of good. If he cannot drift with this general tide and insists upon a certain amount of personal integrity, regardless of the compromises being made around him, he then announces more or less bitterly that this situation has placed him upon the horns of a dilemma. I've heard people actually say that they were sorry that they could think, because it was so unprofitable in terms of comfort or friendship or security. We do come to the final conclusion that man either must lead his life or allow his life to be moved by circumstances. Now, a leadership of life does not mean that he decides that he will be president of the corporation at 40. This is the kind of directive that is dangerous. What it does mean, however, is that growth has told him the code by which he must live. To violate this code is to gradually disintegrate his own character. He therefore has only two possible choices: either to live up to his code or be taken apart by it. If he has any fortitude of nature, whatever, he will find that this code, although it may be more severe than that of the persons around him, is also the basis of a security greater than they can ever know. Therefore, growth brings with it security of being, security of personal existence. The individual, having achieved a certain degree of mental control or discipline, is able to direct his own conduct to conform with his principles. Now, he may feel, and does often feel, that this is a heavy burden upon him, that it is something which is going to make it difficult for him to succeed in the world he is in. Here is where his wisdom, his understanding, and his growth must sustain him. He must decide what constitutes success in terms of ethics. He must decide what he can do and still live with himself. And once having achieved this degree of approaching maturity, he cannot go back to childhood again. He cannot forget what he knows. He cannot give up principles which he has learned to be real. He cannot depart from a faith which has been grown and matured by experience and understanding. He must therefore find what he will find if he searches, namely that this new level of growth has brought with it all the instruments that are necessary for this adjustment, that this adjustment can be made in a healthy, normal, reasonable way, but that it cannot be made by a series of compromises. It can only be made when the individual, having decided what value is willing to support that value, even if it means that he must reject other things that are less valuable. Now, in the problem of growth, the person becomes a fuller person in every sense of the word. And growth brings with it our gradual recognition of the supreme significance of the great ethical codes which have been given to the world by the most mature human beings whom we know. We realize that we have received as a heritage patterns suitable for proper behavior. We also realize that we have not fulfilled these patterns in most instances. Individuals have. Collective groups have not. We know, for example, that the average member of a belief cannot fully live up to the belief which they hold. That this depends upon a degree of growth greater than he possesses, inasmuch as this code was revealed to him by a person whose growth was far greater than his. Therefore, it is a problem of growing toward these principles as we can, but always recognizing that these principles are the best that we know. If when we attain these principles, they are discovered to be in some way inadequate, from this level of greater attainment, we will be able to project further convictions toward adequacy and to correct whatever limitations may be contained within a code. The ages have corrected and amended numerous codes, and it must always be this way. So we are working toward goals. But we cannot work toward them by working contrary to them. We work toward them by falling short of them, but not by voluntarily rejecting them or intentionally disobeying them. The same is true of the Mosaic Code. The same is true of the Gospel of Buddha, or the ethical code of Confucius, or the mystical code of Lao Tzu. The same is found in the mathematical philosophy of Pythagoras, or the great rationalistic systems of Plato and Aristotle. These codes were given to us by highly mature persons. And while a few may arise who can outgrow these codes, the majority of individuals will be a long time growing up to them. It means also, however, that we have directives, and that these directives indicate the kind of conduct that is appropriate to a degree of growth. Also, the kind of conduct to which we aspire by growth, and that therefore our way of growth is not a dim, unknown path, but a path that is marked by clear landmarks, not of a dogmatic nature to the thoughtful person, but of an idealistic nature, suitable to inspire in us the best of ourselves and dedicate the best to the service of the rest. Growth is therefore toward the achievement of a better being. And as a result of this growth, there is an inevitable adjustment with society that is constructive. Impatience is not easily possible where growth is mature. The matured intellect does not expect the impossible. The mature person does not condemn other people for being that which they must reasonably be, considering the attainments which they have. True growth does not require agreement with us. It requires only that the individual shall agree to the best that is in him, and shall labor earnestly to enlarge his capacity to know what is best. That true growth is man's voluntary dedication to the enlargement of his own capacity, so that he will be less and less surprised by the experiences of life, and more able to voluntarily cooperate with the purposes which nature has intended. In this way, he achieves not only his own security, but promotes the growth of the world in which he lives. Physically, when man eats, he must take into his system many vitamins, proteins, carbohydrates, many minerals, many different substances to nourish all the parts of his nature. He does this by a variety of food. In the same way, in the nourishing of his total nature, he must nourish his emotions, his thoughts, his ideas. He must develop the various facets and sides of his mind. He cannot become one-tracked without at the same time suffering from limitation of attitude, meaning in turn inadequacy. And from this inadequacy, he will be unable to perceive clearly value. Therefore, he is limited in his power to grow. He can easily exhaust the small capacity that he has unless he continues to increase his capacity. So what do we do? Some individuals pin all their faith upon certain ideas. One individual believes that if he belongs to a certain belief, thinks of nothing else, studies nothing else, rejects all else, that in this way he will achieve a great deal of penetration. There is no doubt that he does. But if on the physical level of nutrition he made the same decision and decided to restrict his entire diet from now on to nothing but calcium, he would probably end up in a situation resembling that of Lot's wife. He would become a solid block of concrete of some kind. You cannot do things this way. What we have to do is to balance our nutrition. If we fail to balance our mental and emotional nutrition, we are in grave danger of bigotry, of fanaticism, or of falling into some unreasonable belief and the destruction of our common sense. Thus, we must have many things. If we work hard in our business, we must have our relaxations and our pleasures. If we are giving our lives to the advancement of the art of plumbing, it is very important perhaps that we also study music. If we have spent our time as a bookkeeper, we should visit the great art galleries. We should go to the great concerts. If we find ourselves desk-bound day after day, perhaps we need that craft shop where we can make things with our hands. If we are indoors all the time with a limited perspective on life, perhaps we need the garden, the spade, and the power to create flowers and beauty. If our natural life is alone, we need friends. If our family is childless, we need to be associated with children. If various situations arise by which there is a danger that we shall lose contact, and through loss of contact lose sympathy, we must take every possible precaution to preserve these values, because if we do not, we restrict our power to grow. Growth is not intensive achievement in something. This may be profession. This may be trade. This may be the basis of our economic security. But this one-pointedness is the base of our most terrible neurotic situations. We cannot function successfully in this way. To grow, then, means a largeness in ourselves. It means that we no longer have blank spots in our common thinking. For wherever there is a blank spot, there is a potential misunderstanding. Wherever there is darkness, there is a potential lack of understanding, lack of tolerance, lack of patience, lack of sympathy. Thus, our real growth is the general improvement of our nature, so that more and more of our faculty power can be turned to the total process of living. Actually, living is the one process which uses every faculty that we possess. And to live well means that all these faculties must make a reasonable contribution. Now, it is not required that at any particular time man have the full use of all faculties. Such a condition would cause him to far exceed so great a genius as Leonardo da Vinci, who was able to perform or to master more than 60 arts and sciences, but still only to scratch the surface of learning. We are not required to attain such magnificence of ability. We are merely required to use all of our faculties on the level of our general adaptation to life. We are to use the degree of all our faculties as these relate to the station we occupy, the things we are doing, and the degree of understanding which we have already developed. But through the development of the potentials of these faculties, in order to therefore have true growth, we must be continuously improving. This continuous improvement has a distinct tendency to take the sharp edges off of our attitudes. That all moderate attitudes are the basis of solid judgments, and that these moderate attitudes, by not fanning our emotions, permit us to come to factual, honorable, kindly, gracious conclusions without being whipped by some pressure or intensity, or without allowing fanaticism to unseat the reason. Thus, growth shows increasing sense of capacity to administer. It shows increasing ability to adjust to conditions, and an increasing disinclination to hasty judgment, criticism, or condemnation. The really growing person, then, is one who is gradually developing an internal strength that is stronger than external circumstance. If we watch growth, then, and watch the persons whose growth has resulted in the best for mankind, we shall see that these persons, although their lives may have been difficult, certainly had withal a tremendous resource, a tremendous wealth of inner strength, by which the things which would seem to us to be extraordinary sacrifices and tremendous decisions are really, or were really, of very slight importance to these persons. We can think of the case of Socrates, who, rather than pay a small fine which he did not believe was just, preferred to permit himself to be the victim of the injustice of the Athenian state. Socrates' decision to place honor above life would be a decision that would rack us to the soul, and which perhaps we would not normally be able to make, except under some tremendous pressure of circumstances. But to Socrates, this was not a great decision. This was not a soul-shaking catastrophe. It was a simple use of value. He simply lived as he knew he had to live. And when he could no longer live this way, and could only continue to survive by compromising his own inner life, he chose to remain true to that which was true. And the centuries have vindicated him. The same is true of the crucifixion of Jesus. The same is true of the martyrdom of the early Christians in the arena at Rome. The same is true of men who have gone into the jungle and died of various diseases and plagues in order to serve men. The same kind of heroic self-sacrifice to common good has distinguished the career of Dr. Albert Schweitzer. These men apparently have penalized themselves, and instead of a fine city practice and 2 or 3 good automobiles and a chain of apartment houses, Dr. Schweitzer has chosen to go out into the jungles and work with the sick. This is not a sacrifice for him. This is the thing that fulfilled him. This is the thing that made him able to face his life and his God. Therefore, if the individual is really growing, all these sad and sorrowful complaints of the pseudo-growing will not be heard. The individual in growing fulfills. He is that which he most desires to be. And when he most desires to be better than he is, his greatest happiness is to fulfill that desire. And in it also lies his greatest usefulness to himself and his fellow men. It is therefore not a matter of an individual continually placing growth in opposition to comfort. Growth is not uncomfortable. An individual who is trying to claim virtues which he does not possess will be very uncomfortable. But if he is merely claiming the birthright of that which he is, The only thing that can make him uncomfortable is his failure to make the claim. He is resolved and determined that his life shall be lived from the best of himself. When he means this, when he lives accordingly, and when this best in himself sustains him, he is right. If this best in ourselves does not sustain us, then this best is not yet good enough. And our first problem is to make it good enough. We cannot live inconsistently. We cannot live one code on the inside and the other code on the outside of our personalities. If we really intellectually realize that we should be a better person, then it is our immediate holden duty to become that better person. For it is only in that way that we can be happy. Happiness is fulfillment of life purpose. Pleasure is fulfillment, perhaps, of the purposes of change and incident. But where there is pleasure, there is very apt to ultimately be pain, for these are mingled together in a hopeless compound. But where there is true happiness, this happiness absorbs unhappiness into itself. The truly good person, the growing person, can be subject to any affliction that flesh is heir to. But if he is growing, and is truly growing, he will always be equal or greater than his affliction. He will always find that this affliction is less than the achievement which he has attained. Therefore, that he can carry this affliction with a reasonable degree of dignity. Now, it is not true that all good people are afflicted and all bad people have a wonderful time. This is a common belief, but it is not supported by facts. The reason why we think that bad people have a wonderful time is because we do not know them very well and estimate the entire conclusion from a few lines in the paper announcing that they are on their way to some place of pleasure or some resort, or another little line to the effect that they have just bought a new home. These things are what we read about. But the individual who has not achieved to a certain measure of internal integration can never enjoy real happiness. And I have been around enough with people who are envied to know that they in turn envy the simplest person who has peace of soul. This is a common and inevitable circumstance. They envy them, but they are not willing to sacrifice anything of themselves to get that peace of soul. So they die rich and miserable, envied by fools, and knowing in their hearts that they themselves are fools. But caught in a pattern, they find no escape. It is also definitely true that the good and the bad, the intelligent and the foolish, the wise and the simple, must pass through practically all of the major circumstances of life. Therefore, the attainment of wisdom, the adjustment to growth and change arising from within ourselves, does not alter the basic facts of our existence. It alters, however, our ability to handle these facts with dignity, with understanding, and with enlightenment. We may therefore, I think, affirm beyond question, and I believe the experience of ages will support this, that growth does not actually add to burden. It adds to our power to solve burden, to cure that which can be cured, and to bear with dignity, honor, and regard that which cannot be changed. Thus we gain internal poise, freedom, relaxation, and peace. And from this quietude within ourselves must stem further growth. For the future development of the individual grows from the quietude of his present adjustment. It is only within himself that he can grow. It is only when he is at peace with himself that he can become aware of his own needs. It is only in the quietude of a life brought into order by understanding that the person can unfold the natural powers with which he is endowed. So true growth increases those internal elements of peace and adjustment, by which the vision is cleared, by which the mind relieved of false tensions can think more clearly. The emotions freed of false attachments can feel true values more immediately. Out of growth, true growth, therefore, comes the substance of further growth. Out of false growth, or assumed virtues which are not real, there comes no immediate good. Only that ultimate good which comes from the final discovery of the vanity of our own ways. But this can be a very long, expensive, and painful procedure. Ignorance and not wisdom causes suffering, sustains suffering, or makes suffering inevitable. Thus, in adjusting to growth, we have only one principle to concern us: in the observance of ourselves. If we are growing, we find adjustment natural, simple. It emerges from within us. It arises in our own consciousness. We instinctively adjust. We are naturally happy. We are naturally glad that we are privileged to grow. If growth, on the other hand, as we call it, brings with it continuous irritation, leaves us unable to cope with today or tomorrow, alienates us from everyone around us, destroys our value in society, if these situations arise, what we call growth is not growth for us. It is not the thing we need. It is the will attempting to change the nature according to a concept. It is not life unfolding a nature according to its own law. If we can straighten this out in our own thinking, I think we can adjust to any form of growth. Because growth is actually the adventure of life. And we can adjust to it if we are personally willing to make the improvements in ourselves and to recognize the fault signs when they do appear and correct them immediately. Growth then should always be a gradual attainment of those qualities which we admire in persons of acknowledged growth. Throughout the ages, we have respected most those who have grown. And we know that from them the great progress of our world has come. We know that most of these persons were not recognized in their own time or understood. Many were persecuted. But where they were persecuted, we have no evidence that this persecution caused them to be disillusioned in the truths that they held, or to lose faith in the God which they worshiped. Actually, these so-called difficulties bound them more strongly to their conviction and gave them the greater incentive to live well and honorably. Therefore, in summarizing our problem of growth, I think the matter is reasonably simple. If we are truly growing, we are glad. And most of all, if we are truly growing, those around us are glad because we are better people. If those around us are not glad, we should investigate our own growing and make certain that we are not substituting merely stubbornness of opinion for true personal unfoldment. If our own lives have been made more difficult, and we cannot honestly say that growth has been of greater good to us than anything else that has ever happened, then we are not truly growing and must re-estimate our problem to see where our own mistake lies. If for one moment we would really wish to know less than we do, then we do not know as much as we think we do. These problems, thoughtfully and carefully considered, will adapt us to any changes not only due to our own circumstances, but to world circumstances. And regardless of time or place, we will grow and bear a good fruit, and our growth will be like that of a flower, an unfoldment into beauty. And as nature in all ways makes things beautiful in growing, so the human soul becomes beautiful in growing. And the end of all growth in nature is fruitfulness. And the fruitfulness of the soul is peace and love and understanding and patience and charity and unselfishness. These are the fruits of man, and these are the fruits of the tree of life, and these fruits are for the healing of the nations. And until we realize the importance of these truths, these fruits, the sickness of nations will not be remedied. But we have the right to grow, the most blessed right there is. Let us use it wisely and lovingly. Thank you very much.